This is Robbie McKenzie, Youth Ministry 6.3. I'm here with Andy Root, Dr. Andrew Root. He's written a bunch of books that I enjoy, specifically Revisiting Relational Youth Ministry, and I'm trying to power my way through the Children of Divorce book, enjoying that tremendously. And I guess you have an upcoming book, right? I think with Kenda.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it'll come out in October. Yeah,
that's good. What's it called? Something about theological?
Yeah, it's called the Theological Turn in Youth Ministry, I think. So we're trying to make the case that that youth ministry is at least starting to wake up to its theological significance, and so we're trying to. We think that there's already been a turn happening, and we're trying to push and add some momentum to that turning. So
awesome. Yeah, awesome. Well, I look forward to that. Just something I would just want to start before we get into the question about books. How did you, and I'm just curious, how did you get into youth ministry? How did you, if there's a brief version, how did you start in youth ministry? And so if you can just kind of tell that story.
Yeah, it's a good question. Probably like all of us, it's a long, probably the whole story is a long one, but maybe for a lot of us it all starts with the same kind of tagline, which is, I just didn't think I could do anything else. But, and I think that has partly to do with calling and direction. But I had both a young life leader and a youth director in my life that were really significant, and they got me involved in ministry at a really young age, and doing junior high stuff when I was still in high school, and then when I was in college, I went on young life staff, and it was just kind of something I figured I felt called to, but I also just didn't know what else I would do. I mean, it seemed to make sense. And I never thought I would end up in the academic world at all. I never thought that I would be teaching and writing books. I didn't even know that I could complete a sentence, or write anything. But I kind of got addicted to ideas when I was in college, and then found myself in seminary, and all of a sudden found myself in these academic conversations and liked them and felt like they were who I was. And so I've kind of been pushing forward, trying to help youth ministry people like myself who just kind of stumbled into this and felt like we could do nothing else, to think deep thoughts about what we're doing. Because when I reflected on my own ministry experience, and even in the context of ministry I'm in now, where I'm teaching confirmation to 5 kids at our little church, it's amazing how deep the questions go, and how significant. And I guess the need for us to really be thinkers and to analyzing, but also feeling and thinking what we're doing, and how God is active in the midst of that becomes a really significant question, at least for me.
That's awesome. The focus of this interview, I really just wanted to talk about your book that's really impacted me and kind of changed my thinking, at least in the direction I want to go, and that's Revisiting Relational Youth Ministry. Just real quick, and I know it's a deep book, but just if you could, what's your primary focus for the book itself? If you could just kind of talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the primary driving point of the book is really to agree with the assumption that youth ministry has, at its heart, been about relationships. I mean, I think that's been really a common thread that's gone through youth ministry for at least the last couple of decades, that building relationships with young people is a really significant thing. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. I think partly it has something to do with the societal shifts on the importance of the church. It has something to do with the consumer culture. It has something to do with the embedding of the significance of adolescence as this stage of life. I mean, all of these things play into it. But we've really, I think, the rhetoric in youth ministry has been, we really need to build relationships with young people. Relationships are really important. And, I just told you about my early days in ministry, and that was what I was all about. I mean, I was on staff for Young Life for 3 years in Minnesota, and then another year in Southern California, so 4 years of Young Life staff. And, it was all really about building relationships with young people, and some of the most significant relationships I had in my own growing up, or the people that, I guess, passed on the faith to me, were really people who had significant relationships with me. But then I stumbled into ministry in the Southern California community, and I had worked in Young Life in a more middle-class kind of context, and found myself in more of an urban context, and realized that everything I had learned about building relationships with young people was not going to work. And then I started to kind of connect the dots and realize that, well, maybe the stuff that I had done even in my middle class context wasn't really working either. It's just that these kids didn't tell me to get the F out of their face as kids in this more urban context did. And I think I started to realize through working with these young people in this urban context that really the way I understood relationships with them, and one of the reasons I think that they kind of neglected my relational approaches was the fact that they thought that maybe I was on the hustle. That they had grown up in neighborhoods where people were always trying to sell them something or try to get them to do something, and they weren't so sure that the kind of relationship I was offering them really was about them and wasn't about me trying to hustle them into something. And the more I thought about it, the more I had to kind of come to grips with the fact that I kind of was on the hustle. I was trying to hustle them into the church. I was trying to hustle them to see the significance of Jesus in their life. And often those commitments were more important than their person. I mean, I would never really logically assert that. I mean, it was more of a tacit kind of thing, something inside my head. But when I kind of came to grips with this, the truth of the matter was the relationship wasn't as important as the end that I got these young people to. In the end that I was trying to get them to were good things. I mean, there was nothing wrong with that. But really, it wasn't about their humanity and their person that mattered. It was really about what I got them to do. And I guess in the book, I try to go through this journey of saying that I think a lot of youth ministry, at least our rhetoric about how we teach youth ministry, I think there's a lot of intuitive people that do the kind of things that I'm actually sharing in this book. And I hope the book was more of like, oh yeah, this is exactly what I'm doing. And I give them some language for that more than trying to change people's framework. I think there's a lot of people who are doing this. But I think in the rhetoric and how we talk about it and how we write about relationships in youth ministry, that we tend to use them as devices to influence kids towards what we want them to do. So I try to reimagine that, essentially.
Sure. And I guess you see, and in my experience, teenagers are very intuitive. I mean, they can see past, the disingenuous type actions, that instead of, being their friend for just who they are, they can see that we have ulterior motives. We have other things that are against that. And of course, you saw that blatantly, in your experience as well. And so that's been my experience as well. Is that getting past ulterior motives, which kind of leads me. The big thing that you focus on is what I think is amazing. Of course, you use Bonhoeffer's sort of framework there, theology, which I think is crucial. But you talk about play sharing. Kind of just for maybe someone who's not really been in touch with the book or the idea itself, what is play sharing and how can youth ministry go from typical relational focus to what you advocate? I think what I think Christ advocates, and that's play sharing. Yeah.
I mean, it really, it goes back to my own ministry experience again, which I think is the best way we come up with these ideas that I think are significant to us is in the context of actually doing ministry. But I actually had the opportunity of working for a nonprofit organization for 9 months doing gang prevention counseling, which makes me sound really cool and dangerous, like I should have tattoos everywhere or something. And it really wasn't quite as cool as the title of it is. I mean, I basically went into 4 public schools a week and did one-on-one counseling, I guess is what you would call it, and with kids who were either in gangs, family members in a gang, or just their grades had dropped to a terrible level, or they were just having problems. And I would often get these the dossier of the student from the guidance counselor, the principal, and it often would come with a kind of verbal articulation of the student situation, like, well, here's Jesse, and Jesse's we just discovered Jesse sleeping on his sister's floor, and he just came out of an orphanage. Or, here's Jeremy, and Jeremy was arrested for prostituting himself on the street. I mean, these horrific stories, or and then I would sit down with these kids and get them to tell their stories, which was easier said than done. But it was just this utter horrific, broken situation. I mean, these kids were just in terrible, terrible, terrible places. And I realized really quickly, like, there was nothing I could do for these kids. And in my earlier ministry experience, I really thought, and I think this is part of the trap that youth ministry people fall into, is that it was my job to fix these kids, or it was my job, to get these kids changed. And I started to realize, as I read the theology of Bonhoeffer, and as I kind of thought back to my own ministry experience in the church and the young life situation that I had been in, that really what I was called to do and what the gospel was calling me to do was just to share these kids' place, to just be with them. I mean, there was nothing I could do to change these kids' situation. Now, at times we're called into certain forms of action. Like I had to tell a principal once that the student was addicted to crystal meth. I mean, there's things that we have to do. But for the most part, I couldn't change that a kid hadn't seen his dad since he was 3. I couldn't change that a kid's mom was an illegal alien and she was, driving an ice cream truck and they were living in a one-bedroom apartment with 5 people trying to, survive. I couldn't change those facts. But what I could do is for 1 hour once a week share their place with them. I could just be with them. And as I read Bonhoeffer, I started to realize that that's not just kind of this therapeutic thing, or it's not just this kind of way of engendering empathy, though I think there's something really significant about empathy, but it really was a way of imagining the presence of God. That God really, when we see the humanity of the other, because of the Incarnation, because of this idea that Jesus Christ has fully taken on our humanity, Bonhoeffer has this great line in The Cost of Discipleship where he says, well, we continue to transcend, to move past our humanity with pious prayer and with religious activity. While we try to do that, God actually becomes human in Jesus Christ. And so there was this kind of, in that experience with these kids, just sharing their place and seeing their humanity and being with and for them, I really started to imagine it and see it and really engage and participate in, I think, God's own ministry of being with and for us, of sharing our place completely and sharing our place all the way to death and overcoming death with life in the midst of that. So I think really what relational youth ministry or just relational ministry is encountering the humanity of another, just as Jesus Christ in the Incarnation encounters our humanity. And so, again, the book is trying to imagine that. And so I kind of you do these things when you write a book of these kind of binary. So, a relational ministry of influence towards relational ministry of place sharing, which really the call is just to see the humanity of the other as a confession of Jesus Christ. And for the relationship not to be a means to an end, but to be an end in itself. For ministry just to be about encountering the other and trusting that Jesus Christ is present in that through the Incarnation, that Jesus Christ stands with and for us. As Bonhoeffer actually said, Jesus Christ is pro me, or is for you, and Jesus Christ literally stands beside you, that Jesus Christ is with and for you. So encountering a young person isn't just about us getting them somewhere, but actually a youth worker, an adult encountering a young person is the confession that Jesus Christ stands with and for that young person. So it's more participatory, I think.
Sure. Sure. What are some? I'm just thinking. I didn't think about this question, but Henry Nouwen in his book Wounded Healer talks about it's in order to experience kind of what we're talking about, to experience someone their full humanity, you gotta in fact experience brokenness yourself. And there's just thinking about that place sharing and what are some risks, I mean, that comes with place sharing, that comes with sitting down and being more participatory, as you talk about. I mean, just brainstorming or just thinking out loud. What are some risks that youth ministers, volunteers, moms, dads, coaches, whoever encounter with this place sharing?
Yeah, the core risk that I think is really essential that we understand this is that any real relationship where we really encounter the other person and we're really with and for them, which the truth of the matter is that a relationship built on influence, that few of us adult leaders or youth workers would stand for that in any other relationship in our life. Right. We wouldn't stand our spouses just trying to get to know us, to get us to, unload the dishwasher or my part of the world to shovel the driveway.
Oh, wow.
Nor would we stand it from a coworker. If a coworker said, hey, you want to go out for coffee with me, and you're thinking, I'd really like, this is cool, I'm going to get to know this person, and then they sit down and say, hey, I got this great pyramid scheme that I really want you to get in. Screw you, dude. I wanted to get to know you. I wanted you to get to know me, and now I find out that you just want to hang out with me to get me to do something. I mean, we wouldn't stand for that in any other relationship. So once we get over that hurdle, then the question, to actually get to your question, which is what is the risk? The biggest risk is that we don't recognize that any real relationship, like I said, this transcends just youth worker to young person, but any real relationship is based on this open and closed dynamic. That you actually have to be closed to be in relationship. And that's not to quote Bonhoeffer ad nauseum here, but Bonhoeffer has this in probably his most read book, Life Together. He has this assertion where he says, "Be wary of the person who cannot be with others," which makes complete sense.
Absolutely.
But then he continues the statement. He says, "Be just as wary of the person who cannot be alone." And I think one of the real dangers is that we can kind of misinterpret what play sharing means to assume that you're always open to kids and you never say no to kids, and if they call you at 3 a.m, you get in the car and take them wherever, or you talk to them. But what happens when we do that, when we can't say no to kids, is that we no longer become a human being for them to be in relationship with. We become a commodity that they actually get to consume. We become a jungle gym that they actually hang out with. And I think one of the things we need to realize, and I think play sharing really is about, is this recognition that kids don't actually need volunteers, or they don't really need youth workers in their lives. They need human beings to be in relationship with. And one of the ways you actually be a human being to them is by coming to the door once in a while when they stop over 5 nights a week and saying, "Guys, great to see you, but I'm having a glass of wine with my wife, or I have a friend over, or I'm just exhausted and need to watch Family Guy reruns." I mean, saying all that stuff actually doesn't end a relationship, but it engenders it. It deepens it. Because now what you've invited them into is a relationship with a human being, and not just with someone who's paid to meet their needs or paid to hang out with them. So I think the biggest danger in play sharing is to assume that because, like you referenced now, and because it does have a lot to do with sharing in each other's suffering or sharing in each other's deep questions, is to assume that you can never say no.
Absolutely.
That you are always open, and then therefore you can have no boundaries. I actually think it's the opposite. If you really want to be a play sharer, you have to put boundaries in. And to say to a kid, "I'm on vacation," or "I know you were going out with him for like 72 hours, you're heartbroken, but could you call me when the sun comes up?" That stuff actually says you're going to be in a relationship with a human being and not with just someone who has either religious guilt or is being paid to meet your needs.
Absolutely. That's awesome. Just a couple of random questions, and then we'll close. One of them is, if you could, and I know this is probably tough for you, but if you could recommend, say, 3 books to a youth minister. Yeah. I know that's horrible to say 3 books, but if you said, okay, 3 books, what would you recommend?
Oh gosh, you are really putting me on the spot here.
I know.
Yeah. All right, 3 books that I would really recommend. I would definitely recommend Kenda Dean's Practicing Passion. I think it's a significant practical theological piece that is deep, so I would definitely recommend that. I'd also recommend one of my own theological teachers. Actually, I'd recommend 2 books that come from both of my teachers. One is Ray Anderson's book, The Soul of Ministry, which is a very readable theological text, but also I think will open up people's imagination to think about what ministry is and how primarily ministry really is about participation in the action of God. And I have a project I'm actually working on with Zondervan now that will come out in about 1.5 years that's trying to really make a case that what youth ministry really is for is not for keeping kids good or not for passing on a tradition, which is usually why churches tend to invest a good amount of money in youth ministry, and why denominational bodies tend to invest in youth ministry, because they want to make more Methodists or they want to make more Lutherans or whatever. And parents tend to put a lot of money in offering plates because they think having their kids involved in a youth ministry will keep them good. And that's all fine, but we fall into certain traps, and I think certain mindless traps at times. So I'm trying to make a case, really following this book, The Soul of Ministry, and Ray Anderson's work, is to make the argument that really what youth ministry is about is participating in the action of God. Which is, in many ways, what Revisiting Relational Ministry is about, is trying to argue that the relationship itself is how we participate in God's presence in the world. So I'd recommend that one. Do you like how I answer your questions with long? Yes.
I do.
I've spent far too much time in the academic work.
That's right.
You answered questions, anyhow. And then the third book would be another one of my theological teachers, which may be really interesting for some people and maybe kind of a different theological tune to it, but I think is really important, is Douglas John Hall's book, The Cross in Our Context. which is a really interesting book because he's trying to recover Luther's theology of the cross, but putting it in context of a kind of a post-Christendom world. And those are some books that I have my own students read that I think are significant. Obviously, the last two are not directly about youth ministry, but I think are significant, deep thinking books. If I had to add a fourth, which here is I'm taking your question where you didn't ask it. But if I had to add a fourth, that I've given you three really theoretical books, and I tend to live more in the theoretical to my shame in some ways. But if I had to add a real practical book that will help you keep your job, is Mark DeVries' Sustainable Youth Ministry, which I think is filled with just really practical wisdom. And I've had a chance to travel with Mark and to do kind of co-presentations, and it's just really helpful to hear some of his stuff, especially some of the esoteric things I say. For him to really get people's feet on the ground is helpful. So that would be my fourth for a real kind of practical handle. So
awesome. All right, last question. Put you on the spot again. Say I'm a brand new youth minister, wet behind the ears. I'm new, green as they come, as they may say. I'm just new. First work ever, first full-time work. What bit of advice, and I'm sure you encounter many who come across or who are first-time youth ministers, what bit of advice would you give me to kind of hit the ground running, to get going? What bit of advice would you give me?
Yeah, the main advice that I would give you is, first of all, to go slow and to listen, and really spend your first 6 months just trying to figure out who these people are and what this place is about. But then the main advice that I would give you is to not imagine yourself as just the youth worker, as just the youth pastor, as just the youth director. Clearly, that's your job. But usually what happens is we imagine ourselves that way, and then we think that's our only responsibility. So we get to know kids, we have kids get to know us, and we take responsibility for them, and then we kind of are frustrated with parents, or we wish just the other pastoral staff would leave us alone to do our work. But I think really to help young people and to really do youth ministry, you have to accrue just as much respect and appreciation by the adults in the congregation.
Sure.
So I would really encourage a new youth worker to go and hang out with kids, but go and hang out with other adults in the congregation as well. If you're going to take a kid out for coffee or, to hang out with them, do it with an adult once in a while too, or, just as much. And because I really think your job is to stand in the gap between the young people and the adults in the congregation, to stand in that gap. And your job really is not to do the ministry, would be the other thing I would say. That's not your job. Your job is to help this community do its ministry. So, you need some expertise, and you need to know some things, and you need to be a leader, but your job is not to do youth ministry. Your job is to help this community do youth ministry. To do something that throughout the history of the church has recognized it's had to do, which is pass on its faith to its children. And now we live in this weird day and age where we just think, it's the youth worker's job to do that. It's the youth pastor's job to do that. So I guess my first advice for you would be really to get to know the adults in the congregation so that they can trust you, so that you can build and actually become place sharers for these adults in this congregation. And then invite them to be place sharers for young people in the congregation. So I think you cannot go wrong recognizing that and spending time doing that.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. Andy, hang on a little bit. This has been Andy Root, Professor Andy Root, awesome guy, learned so much. Thank you for tuning in.